The human mind presents one of the most profound puzzles in the natural world, not because it is hidden from us, but precisely because it is the very instrument we must use to understand itself. This recursive quality, consciousness, examining consciousness, thought. Investigating thought has shaped the entire history of inquiry into mental phenomena, from the earliest philosophical traditions to the most recent findings in cognitive neuroscience. What makes the study of the mind particularly challenging is that we cannot step outside our own mental experience to observe it objectively, the way we might examine a rock or a distant star. Every observation we make about the mind is itself a mental act, filtered through the very processes we seek to understand. This fundamental limitation has generated centuries of debate about whether objective knowledge of mental phenomena is even possible, and if so, what form such knowledge might take. The ancient world approached questions about the mind within frameworks that differed substantially from modern conceptions, yet contained observations that remain relevant to contemporary research. In ancient Egypt, medical papyri dating to approximately 1700 BCE described cases of brain injury and their effects on bodily function, suggesting early recognition that the organ inside the skull played some role in controlling the body. However, Egyptian embalmers removed the brain during mummification while carefully preserving the heart, reflecting a widespread belief that the heart served as the seat of intelligence, emotion, and personal identity. This cardiac-centric view persisted across many ancient cultures, appearing in Hebrew scriptures, early Chinese medical texts, and Greek literature before the classical period. When we encounter phrases about the heart as the source of feeling or thought in contemporary language, we are hearing echoes of conceptual frameworks that predated any systematic understanding of neural function. Greek philosophers initiated a more sustained examination of mental phenomena, though their approaches varied considerably. Alcmaeon of Croton, working in the 5th century BCE, conducted dissections that led him to propose the brain as the organ of thought, noting the connection between the sensory organs and the brain through what we now recognize as cranial nerves. Hippocratic physicians similarly located mental functions in the brain, arguing in texts such as On the Sacred Disease that conditions like epilepsy resulted from natural brain dysfunction rather than divine intervention. Yet Aristotle, one of the most influential thinkers in Western history, rejected this brain-centered view, instead proposing that the heart served as the source of sensation, emotion, and thought, with the brain functioning primarily as a cooling mechanism for the blood. This disagreement between major intellectual traditions illustrates how observational evidence could be interpreted within very different theoretical frameworks, a pattern that would recur throughout the history of mental science. The Aristotelian view dominated European thought for over a millennium, reinforced by its integration into Christian theological frameworks during the medieval period. The brain-centered alternative, preserved and developed in Arabic medical traditions, gradually re-entered European discourse through translations of Greek and Arabic texts in the 12th and 13th centuries. Medieval scholars attempted to reconcile ancient authorities with theological requirements, leading to elaborate theories about the localization of mental faculties within the ventricles of the brain. These ventricular theories proposed that the front ventricle housed common sense and imagination, the middle ventricle contained reason and judgment, and the rear ventricle stored memory. While anatomically incorrect, these theories represented genuine attempts to explain observed relationships between brain damage and specific cognitive deficits, building on clinical observations that certain injuries produce particular patterns of impairment. The transition toward modern conceptions of the mind accelerated during the 17th century, when René Descartes formulated his influential dualist philosophy. Descartes proposed a fundamental distinction between mind and body, treating them as two entirely different substances: extended matter, which occupied space and could be studied through physics, and thinking substance, which lacked spatial properties and operated according to different principles. This Cartesian dualism addressed certain theological concerns about the soul's immortality, while permitting mechanical explanations of bodily function, but it generated a puzzle that has persisted in various forms ever since. How do two fundamentally different substances interact? Descartes proposed the pineal gland as the point of interaction, largely because he believed it was the only brain structure not duplicated across hemispheres. But this anatomical suggestion satisfied few of his contemporaries and has found no support in subsequent research. The mind-body problem that Descartes articulated so sharply has taken different forms across subsequent centuries, but its core difficulty remains. If mental events are fundamentally different from physical events, as dualism proposes, then the regular correlations we observe between them become deeply mysterious. If I decide to raise my arm and my arm rises, some explanation is needed for how a non-physical intention produces a physical movement. If I step on a sharp object and feel pain, some account is required of how a physical event generates a non-physical sensation. Various philosophical positions have attempted to resolve or dissolve this problem, including idealism, which proposes that only mental phenomena are ultimately real, and materialism or physicalism, which proposes that only physical phenomena exist and mental states are somehow identical with or reducible to brain states. Each position faces its own difficulties, and the lack of consensus after several centuries of debate suggests that the problem touches on fundamental issues about the nature of explanation itself. Empirical investigation of the mind proceeded despite unresolved philosophical questions, driven partly by practical needs in medicine and education. Franz Joseph Gall, working in the early 19th century, proposed that different mental faculties were localized in different brain regions, and that the strength of each faculty could be assessed by examining the shape of the skull. This phrenological program, while wrong in its specific claims and methods, helped establish the research agenda of seeking localized brain functions, an agenda that would prove more fruitful when pursued with better techniques. The clinical observations of Paul Broca and Karl Wernicke in the 1860s and 1870s provided more solid evidence for localization, demonstrating that damage to specific left hemisphere regions produced particular types of language impairment. These findings suggested that at least some mental functions depended on circumscribed brain areas, though the relationship between localized processing and unified conscious experience remained unclear. The establishment of experimental psychology as a distinct discipline is conventionally dated to 1879, when Wilhelm Wundt opened his laboratory in Leipzig, though significant experimental work on perception and reaction time had been conducted earlier by researchers such as Ernst Heinrich Weber, Gustav Fechner, and Hermann von Helmholtz. What distinguished Wundt's program was its systematic attempt to study conscious experience through controlled introspection, using trained observers to report on their mental states under standardized conditions. This introspectionist approach faced immediate challenges regarding reliability and replicability, since different laboratories often produce conflicting results when ostensibly studying the same mental phenomena. The method also proved incapable of addressing many psychological questions, particularly those involving unconscious processes, developmental change, or cross-cultural variation. The early 20th century witnessed a sharp methodological reaction against introspectionism in the form of behaviorism, particularly as articulated by John B. Watson, and later B.F. Skinner. Behaviorists argued that psychology should restrict itself to the study of observable behavior and the environmental conditions that controlled it, abandoning any attempt to investigate inner mental states directly. This approach produced genuine advances in understanding learning, conditioning, and behavioral modification, but it faced increasing criticism for ignoring the very phenomena that most people considered central to mental life, including thought, imagination, planning, and subjective experience. The cognitive revolution of the 1950s and 1960s, influenced by developments in linguistics, computer science, and information theory, brought mental representations and internal processes back into psychological research, though with new theoretical frameworks and experimental methods. Contemporary cognitive science emerged from this revolution as an interdisciplinary enterprise, drawing on psychology, neuroscience, computer science, linguistics, philosophy, and anthropology. Researchers within this framework typically treat the mind as an information processing system, analysing mental phenomena in terms of representations and computational operations performed upon them. This computational approach has generated productive research programs in perception, memory, language, reasoning, and decision-making, though its foundational assumptions remain contested. Critics have questioned whether the computer metaphor adequately captures the embodied, embedded and inactive character of biological cognition, leading to alternative approaches that emphasize the role of bodily interaction with the environment in shaping mental processes. Neuroscience has transformed our understanding of the physical substrate underlying mental phenomena, though the relationship between neural activity and conscious experience remains poorly understood. The human brain contains approximately 86 billion neurons, each forming thousands of synaptic connections with other neurons, creating a network of staggering complexity. Researchers have mapped some of the major pathways and identified brain regions associated with particular functions, but the translation from neural patterns to subjective experience continues to elude explanation. This explanatory gap, sometimes called the hard problem of consciousness, concerns why physical processes in the brain should be accompanied by subjective experience at all. Even if we could identify the complete neural correlates of consciousness, we would still face the question of why those particular physical processes feel like anything from the inside. The investigation of perception reveals the active, constructive nature of mental processes, contradicting naive assumptions that we simply receive information from the external world. Visual perception, the most extensively studied sensory modality, involves multiple stages of processing that transform the patterns of light striking the retina into coherent representations of objects, surfaces, and spaces. The retinal image is inverted, two-dimensional, and constantly shifting with eye movements, yet we experience an upright, three-dimensional stable world. This transformation requires the brain to make inferences about the external causes of sensory input, drawing on prior knowledge, contextual information, and implicit assumptions about the structure of the environment. Illusions and misperceptions occur when these inferential processes go astray, when the assumptions built into the visual system fail to match the actual situation. The study of visual illusions has provided particularly revealing insights into the mechanisms of perception. The Mueller-Lyer illusion, in which two lines of equal length appear unequal when adorned with inward or outward pointing arrows, demonstrates that perceived length depends not just on the retinal image of the line itself, but on the surrounding context. Various explanations have been proposed for this illusion, including theories that relate it to depth perception in carpentered environments with rectangular architecture, though cross-cultural studies have complicated this interpretation by showing that individuals from cultures with different built environments experience the illusion differently. The variation across cultures suggests that perceptual processing is shaped by experience, not just hardwired neural circuitry, while the persistence of the illusion even when viewers know the lines are equal suggests that this shaping occurs at levels of processing that are not accessible to conscious correction. Motion perception involves additional inferential processes, as the brain must determine which changes in the visual field result from movement of external objects and which result from movements of the eyes, head, or body. The visual system accomplishes this by integrating retinal information with signals about self-movement, but this integration can be fooled by unusual conditions. The experience of illusory self-motion when sitting in a stationary train while an adjacent train moves illustrates the strength of visual signals in generating motion experience. The brain interprets the large field visual motion as most likely resulting from self-movement, because that is the usual cause of such patterns under normal circumstances. This inference is reasonable, given typical conditions, but produces error in the atypical situation of the train station. Attention functions as a selection mechanism that allows certain information to receive enhanced processing, while other information is suppressed or ignored. The limitations of attention were dramatically demonstrated by research on inattentional blindness, in which observers focused on one aspect of a visual display fail to notice unexpected but clearly visible events. The famous invisible gorilla experiment, conducted by Daniel Simons and Christopher Shabry in 1999, showed that observers counting basketball passes frequently failed to notice a person in a gorilla costume walking through the middle of the scene. This failure occurs not because the gorilla is somehow invisible in a physical sense, but because attentional selection excluded it from conscious awareness. Such findings have practical implications for situations ranging from driving to radiological screening. where important but unexpected events may be missed by observers focused on other tasks. Change blindness, a related phenomenon, reveals that observers often fail to detect changes in visual scenes that seem obvious once pointed out. In experiments using the flicker paradigm, two versions of an image alternate with brief blank intervals, and observers frequently take many seconds or even minutes to notice the difference between them. The changes involved are not subtle. They might include the removal of a large object or the alteration of a prominent colour, but the transient mask prevents the detection of the local motion signal that would normally draw attention to the change. These findings suggest that our sense of having a complete, detailed representation of the visual world is largely illusory. We retain far less information from moment to moment than our subjective experience suggests, filling in missing details through inference and assumption rather than continuous perception. Memory, like perception, proves to be a constructive process rather than a simple recording of experience. The consolidation of memories involves the gradual stabilization of neural representations over time, with sleep playing an important role in this process. Memories are not stored as fixed recordings, but as patterns of neural connectivity that must be reconstructed each time they are retrieved. This reconstructive process introduces possibilities for error and distortion, as current knowledge, expectations, and suggestions can influence what is remembered about past events. The study of eyewitness testimony has demonstrated how unreliable human memory can be under conditions that seem favourable for accurate recall. Witnesses who are confident about their identifications are often wrong, and confidence does not reliably predict accuracy. Elizabeth Loftus's research on the misinformation effect has shown how post-event information can alter memories of witnessed events. When witnesses receive misleading information after observing an event, this information becomes incorporated into their memory of the event itself. Witnesses might remember seeing a yield sign instead of a stop sign, or attribute actions to the wrong person, or recall details that were never present. These memory distortions are not lies or deliberate fabrications. They reflect genuine changes in what the witness believes they experienced. The implications extend beyond the courtroom to everyday life, where our autobiographical memories are subject to ongoing revision through retelling, reinterpretation, and integration with later knowledge. The phenomenon of false memories demonstrates even more dramatically how memory can go wrong. Under certain conditions, people can come to remember events that never occurred, sometimes with high confidence and vivid detail. Laboratory research has implanted false memories of childhood events by combining suggestive interview techniques with false evidence such as doctored photographs. Participants come to remember and often elaborate on experiences that were entirely fabricated by the researchers. The ease with which such memories can be created raises troubling questions about the reliability of recovered memories, particularly those emerging in therapeutic contexts where suggestive techniques may be employed. This research does not imply that all recovered memories are false. Genuine forgotten memories can certainly be recovered, but it demonstrates that the emergence of a memory is not sufficient evidence that the remembered event actually occurred. The nature of forgetting has attracted research attention since the earliest days of experimental psychology. Hermann Ebbinghaus, working in the 1880s, conducted systematic studies of memory, using himself as the only subject, learning lists of nonsense syllables and testing his retention at various intervals. His forgetting curve showed rapid initial forgetting followed by a gradual levelling off, a pattern that has been replicated countless times with different materials and populations. The processes underlying forgetting remain debated, with theories emphasizing decay over time, interference from other memories, and retrieval failure all receiving empirical support under different conditions. What seems clear is that forgetting is not simply a passive loss of information, but involves active processes that can be influenced by subsequent experience, emotional state, and deliberate effort. Prospective memory, the ability to remember to perform intended actions in the future, has received increasing research attention as distinct from the retrospective memory studied in traditional paradigms. Remembering to take medication, to attend an appointment, or to pass along a message requires different processes than remembering past events. Prospective memory failures are extremely common in everyday life, and can have serious consequences in domains such as aviation, medicine, and nuclear power plant operation. Research has identified factors that influence prospective memory success, including the distinctiveness of the cue that should trigger retrieval, the strength of the intention, and the cognitive load imposed by ongoing activities. Some of this research has led to practical interventions, such as improved checklists and alarm systems in safety-critical environments. The study of expertise reveals how extensive practice reshapes cognitive processes in domain-specific ways. Chess masters, expert musicians, skilled athletes, and other highly practiced individuals do not simply do the same things as novices, but faster or more accurately. They perceive, remember, and think about their domains differently. The classic research on chess expertise by Adrian de Groot and later Herbert Simon showed that masters could reproduce briefly glimpsed game positions far better than novices, but only when the positions represented plausible game situations. When pieces were arranged randomly, masters showed no memory advantage. This finding suggests that expertise involves the development of sophisticated pattern recognition that allows rapid encoding of meaningful configurations, along with extensive knowledge of typical patterns and their implications. The acquisition of expertise appears to require extended deliberate practice, typically estimated at around 10 years or 10,000 hours, though these figures have been subject to considerable debate. Deliberate practice differs from mere repetition or enjoyable engagement with an activity. It involves focused effort on aspects that need improvement, typically under the guidance of a teacher who can identify weaknesses and structure appropriate training. The benefits of deliberate practice are domain-specific. Expertise in chess does not transfer to expertise in music or medicine. This specificity suggests that expertise is largely a matter of accumulated knowledge and refined procedures rather than enhanced general cognitive capacity, though there may be some transfer of general metacognitive skills involved in effective learning. Language represents one of the most remarkable products of the human mind, a system of such complexity that its acquisition by every normally developing child seems almost miraculous. Children acquire the language of their community without formal instruction, learning thousands of words and intricate grammatical patterns through exposure during the first years of life. The rapidity and uniformity of this acquisition, despite variation in intelligence and experience, led Noam Chomsky to propose that humans possess an innate language acquisition device, a set of biologically specified constraints that guide language learning. This nativist position has generated decades of debate, with alternative theories emphasizing the role of general learning mechanisms, social interaction, and statistical patterns in linguistic input. The critical period hypothesis proposes that language acquisition proceeds most readily during early childhood, with decreasing facility as the brain matures. Evidence for this hypothesis comes from cases of children who experienced linguistic deprivation during early years and showed persistent deficits despite later exposure, from the declining success of second language learners with increasing age of acquisition, and from neuroimaging studies showing different patterns of brain activation for languages learned early versus late. However, the evidence is not entirely consistent, and researchers disagree about whether there is a sharp critical period or a more gradual decline in language learning ability. Some aspects of language, particularly phonology and grammar, seem more affected by age of acquisition than others, such as vocabulary, which can continue to expand throughout life. The relationship between language and thought has occupied philosophers and psychologists for centuries, with positions ranging from claims that language determines thought to arguments that language merely expresses thought without shaping it. The strong version of linguistic relativity, sometimes called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, proposed that the structure of one's language determines the structure of one's thought, making speakers of different languages inhabit fundamentally different cognitive worlds. This strong version has found little support in empirical research, as humans demonstrate many cognitive capacities that do not depend on linguistic encoding. However, weaker versions of linguistic relativity have received more favourable evidence, suggesting that language can influence certain aspects of thought, particularly in domains where habitual patterns of linguistic encoding draw attention to some distinctions while ignoring others. Research on colour perception provides a paradigm case for investigating linguistic relativity. Languages differ in how they categorize the color spectrum, with some making distinctions that others ignore and vice versa. The question is whether these linguistic differences correspond to differences in perceptual experience or memory for colors. Some studies have found that speakers are faster to discriminate colors that have different names in their language, or better at remembering such colors, suggesting an influence of linguistic categories on perception or memory. Other studies have found similar effects in the right visual field, which is processed by the left hemisphere where language areas are located, but not in the left visual field, suggesting that the effect may involve online linguistic processing rather than deep restructuring of perception. Bilingualism and multilingualism offer a natural laboratory for studying the cognitive effects of language. Contrary to earlier fears that learning multiple languages might confuse children or limit their cognitive development, research has consistently shown cognitive benefits associated with bilingual experience. Bilingual individuals typically perform better on tasks requiring attentional control and executive function, presumably because managing two language systems requires constantly suppressing interference from the non-target language. Some longitudinal studies have suggested that bilingualism may delay the onset of dementia symptoms by several years, though this finding remains controversial and difficult to disentangle from other variables that differ between bilingual and monolingual populations. The study of reading reveals how the mind adapts a system evolved for general visual and language processing to a culturally invented task. Reading is too recent an invention to have exerted selective pressure on human evolution. Writing systems are only about 5,000 years old, and mass literacy is far more recent. Yet skilled readers process text with remarkable speed and efficiency, recognizing words in fractions of a second and extracting meaning from complex sentences with little conscious effort. The acquisition of reading skill involves the development of specialized neural circuits, sometimes called the visual word form area, that become tuned to the orthographic patterns of the reader's language. Neuroimaging studies show that this area activates in response to written words, but not to other visual stimuli or to spoken language. Learning to read requires establishing connections between the visual patterns of written language and the phonological and semantic representations already developed for spoken language. Alphabetic writing systems encode phonology, requiring learners to master the mappings between letters and sounds. Languages differ in the consistency of these mappings, with some, like Finnish or Italian, having relatively transparent orthographies where spelling predicts pronunciation reliably, while others, like English or French, have more opaque systems with many irregular spellings. Children learning to read in languages with transparent orthographies typically reach basic reading proficiency faster than those learning opaque orthographies, though they eventually converge. Dyslexia, a specific reading disability affecting perhaps 5 to 10% of the population, appears to involve difficulties with the phonological processing that underlies learning to read, though the precise nature and causes of these difficulties remain subjects of ongoing research. Decision-making research has revealed systematic departures from the predictions of classical rational choice theory, which assumed that people maximize expected utility by weighting outcomes by their probabilities and values. The work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, beginning in the 1970s, documented numerous ways in which human judgment and decision-making deviate from normative models. Prospect theory, their descriptive alternative to expected utility theory, proposed that people evaluate outcomes relative to a reference point rather than in absolute terms, that losses loom larger than equivalent gains, and that people are risk-averse for gains but risk-seeking for losses. These features help explain many otherwise puzzling phenomena, such as the reluctance to sell stocks at a loss even when the money could be better invested elsewhere. Heuristics, the mental shortcuts that people use to make judgments under uncertainty, can produce systematic biases when applied in situations where they lead astray. The availability heuristic leads people to judge the frequency or probability of events based on how easily examples come to mind, which is influenced not just by actual frequency, but by factors such as recency, vividness, and emotional salience. Thus, people overestimate the frequency of dramatic causes of death, such as plane crashes or homicides, while underestimating more common but less memorable causes. The representativeness heuristic leads people to judge probability based on similarity to typical cases, producing errors such as the conjunction fallacy, in which adding a representative detail to a description increases its judged probability, even though conjunctions must be less probable than their components. Anchoring effects demonstrate how initial information, even if irrelevant, can influence subsequent judgments. When asked to estimate quantities, people adjust from an initial anchor, but typically adjust insufficiently, so their final estimates remain biased toward the anchor. This occurs even when the anchor is obviously random, as when participants spin a wheel before making their estimates. Anchoring has been demonstrated in contexts ranging from real estate pricing to judicial sentencing, suggesting that experts as well as novices are susceptible to this influence. The mechanisms underlying anchoring remain debated, with explanations ranging from insufficient adjustment from the anchor as a starting point to selective retrieval of anchor-consistent information. Overconfidence represents one of the most robust findings in judgment research. People typically express more confidence in their judgments than is warranted by their accuracy. When people say they are certain, they're often wrong. Calibration studies show that propositions judged to be true with 90% confidence are typically correct only about 70 to 80% of the time. This overconfidence extends to predictions about one's own future behavior and circumstances, where optimistic biases lead people to underestimate how long tasks will take, how likely they are to experience negative events, and how much they will change over time. The planning fallacy, the tendency to underestimate task completion, times even when one is aware of past underestimation, proves remarkably resistant to correction. Confirmation bias describes the tendency to seek, interpret, and remember information in ways that confirm existing beliefs, while giving less attention to disconfirming evidence. This bias manifests in multiple ways. People preferentially seek information that they expect to support their views, interpret ambiguous information as supporting their views, and better remember information consistent with their views. Researchers have demonstrated confirmation bias across domains from political attitudes to clinical diagnosis to scientific reasoning. The bias is not simply a result of motivated cognition or wishful thinking, though motivation can enhance it. It appears to reflect fundamental features of how the cognitive system processes information. Disconfirming a hypothesis requires constructing alternatives, which is cognitively demanding in ways that confirming a hypothesis is not. The phenomenon of belief perseverance shows how difficult it is to undo the effects of misinformation, even when it is explicitly corrected. Studies have shown that after people are told that initial information was false, such as that a fire was caused by improperly stored paint cans and then learning this was wrong, they continue to rely on the misinformation in their subsequent reasoning. This occurs even when people accept the correction and can recall it when asked. The debunked information seems to leave a residue in memory that continues to influence judgment and reasoning. This finding has implications for understanding the impact of misinformation in domains such as politics and health, where corrections often fail to undo the damage of initial false claims. Emotional processes interact with cognitive processes in complex ways that traditional models often neglected. The somatic marker hypothesis, proposed by Antonio Damasio based on studies of patients with damage to ventromedial prefrontal cortex, suggests that emotional reactions guide decision-making by marking certain options as favourable or unfavourable. Patients with such damage show impaired decision-making in real-life situations despite intact performance on standard tests of reasoning and intelligence. They seem unable to learn from negative consequences or to anticipate the emotional impact of their choices. This research suggests that emotion is not merely an interference with rational decision-making, but an integral part of adaptive judgment, providing information that conscious reasoning alone cannot easily access. Mood states influence cognition in multiple ways, affecting what information is retrieved from memory, how ambiguous situations are interpreted, and what strategies are employed in thinking and problem-solving. Positive moods generally facilitate creative, flexible, and integrative thinking, while negative moods tend to promote more careful, analytical, and detail-oriented processing. These effects may be functional, as positive moods signal safe environments where exploration is appropriate, while negative moods signal problems that require careful attention. However, these patterns are not invariable. The fit between mood and task requirements determines whether mood effects enhance or impair performance. The study of unconscious processes has revealed that much of mental life occurs outside of awareness. Research using implicit memory tasks, priming paradigms, and subliminal perception demonstrates that stimuli can influence behavior without being consciously perceived, and that past experiences can influence current performance without being explicitly remembered. Patients with amnesia who cannot consciously recall previously studied words nevertheless show priming effects when asked to complete word stems or make speeded responses. Split-brain patients whose corpus callosum has been severed to treat epilepsy show that the right hemisphere can respond to information presented to it, even when the left hemisphere, which controls verbal report, is unaware of that information. These findings suggest that consciousness provides access to only a fraction of the processing that the brain performs. The adaptive unconscious, as described by Timothy Wilson and others, performs sophisticated functions including learning, evaluation, and goal pursuit, often more efficiently than conscious processing. Studies of expertise suggest that highly practiced skills become automatized, operating without the need for conscious attention, and sometimes actually degraded by attempts at conscious monitoring. Experts asked to pay attention to their actions sometimes perform worse than when allowed to operate on autopilot. This automaticity frees conscious attention for novel or difficult aspects of tasks, but can create problems when the automatized responses are inappropriate for the current situation. Many errors in skilled performance result from the intrusion of well-learned responses in contexts where they do not apply. The capacity for conscious attention appears to be severely limited, as revealed by dual task studies showing that people struggle to perform two demanding tasks simultaneously. The psychological refractory period refers to the delay in responding to a second stimulus, when it follows closely after a first stimulus requiring a response. This delay suggests a bottleneck in central processing capacity that limits what can be done in parallel. The exact nature and location of this bottleneck remain debated, with theories proposing limits on response selection, on the retrieval of information from long-term memory, or on the consolidation of information into working memory. Whatever its precise locus, the limitation on parallel processing means that multitasking, so valued in contemporary culture, often results in reduced performance on all tasks being juggled. Working memory, the system that maintains and manipulates information in the service of ongoing cognition, has emerged as a central concept in cognitive psychology. Alan Baddeley's influential model proposed multiple components including a phonological loop for verbal information, a visuospatial sketchpad for spatial and visual information, and a central executive that coordinates the other components. Individual differences in working memory capacity correlate with performance across a wide range of cognitive tasks, from reading comprehension to mathematical reasoning to fluid intelligence. Training programs that claim to increase working memory capacity have proliferated, though the evidence for their effectiveness remains mixed and controversial. Some studies show improvement on trained tasks without transfer to untrained tasks, while others claim broader transfer that critics attribute to methodological weaknesses. Executive functions, the higher-order cognitive processes that control and regulate other processes, include abilities such as inhibiting prepotent responses, shifting between tasks or mental sets, and updating working memory contents. These functions develop throughout childhood and adolescence, with the prefrontal cortex, which supports them, being among the last brain regions to fully mature. Individual differences in executive function predict academic achievement, occupational success, physical health, and other life outcomes even when controlling for general intelligence. The development of executive function can be influenced by environmental factors, including parenting practices, educational experiences, and exposure to stress, suggesting potential targets for intervention to reduce disadvantage. The development of cognitive abilities in children has been investigated since the pioneering work of Jean Piaget, who proposed that children pass through qualitatively distinct stages of cognitive development. Piaget's stage theory, while enormously influential, has been substantially revised in light of subsequent research, showing greater competence in young children than Piaget attributed to them, and less uniformity in development across domains than the stage model implied. Infants demonstrate surprising capacities for physical reasoning, numerical cognition, and social understanding when tested with methods that do not require the verbal and motor responses that Piaget's tasks demanded. These findings suggest that development involves the elaboration and integration of early emerging capacities rather than the wholesale replacement of one mode of thought by another. Theory of mind, the ability to attribute mental states to others, and to understand that others may have beliefs, desires, and knowledge different from one's own, develops during the preschool years in typically developing children. The classic false belief task, in which children must predict behavior based on a character's mistaken belief rather than the actual state of affairs, is typically passed around age 4 to 5. Younger children seem to assume that others share their own knowledge, responding based on reality rather than on the character's limited perspective. Some researchers have claimed that even infants show implicit understanding of false belief, looking longer at outcomes that violate expectations based on belief attribution. Though these claims remain controversial, understanding of minds continues to develop beyond early childhood, with appreciation of more complex mental states, nested beliefs, and subtle social dynamics emerging through middle childhood and adolescence. Autism spectrum disorder involves characteristic differences in social cognition, including difficulties with theory of mind tasks. Simon Baron-Cohen and colleagues proposed that autism could be understood as a form of mind blindness, an impairment in the normally developing system for intuiting mental states. This theory explains many features of autism, including difficulties with social interaction, communication, and understanding deception and figurative language. However, the theory has been criticized as too narrow, failing to account for non-social features of autism such as restricted interests, repetitive behaviors, and sensory sensitivities. Current understanding treats autism as involving differences across multiple cognitive and perceptual domains, with considerable heterogeneity across individuals on the spectrum. Social cognition, more broadly, involves the processes by which people make sense of themselves and others in the social world. Attribution theory examines how people explain behavior, whether by reference to internal characteristics of the actor, such as personality traits, or to external situational factors. Research has documented attributional biases, including the correspondence bias or fundamental attribution error, the tendency to attribute others' behavior to their dispositions while underweighting situational constraints. When we see someone behave rudely, we tend to conclude that they are a rude person, while when we ourselves behave rudely, we are more likely to invoke situational explanations such as having had a difficult day. This asymmetry may reflect differences in the information available from first-person and third-person perspectives as well as motivational factors. Stereotypes function as cognitive structures that influence the perception and interpretation of individuals based on their group memberships. Once activated, stereotypes shape attention, encoding, retrieval, and judgment in ways that tend to confirm and perpetuate them. Ambiguous behaviors are interpreted consistently with stereotypes. Stereotype-consistent information is better remembered than stereotype-inconsistent information, and the presence of a single group member can activate the entire stereotype and influence processing of subsequent information. These effects occur largely automatically and can influence judgment even among people who consciously reject the stereotypic beliefs. The implicit association test, developed by Anthony Greenwald and Mahzarin Banaji, measures the strength of automatic associations between concepts and has been widely used to assess implicit biases that may differ from explicitly endorsed attitudes. The self-concept involves the cognitive representations that people hold about themselves, including beliefs about their traits, abilities, values, and social roles. These representations influence attention, memory, and judgment in egocentric ways, with self-relevant information receiving privileged processing. The self-reference effect refers to superior memory for information encoded in relation to the self, compared to information encoded in other ways. Self-esteem, the evaluative component of self-concept, varies across individuals and fluctuates within individuals across situations. Low self-esteem is associated with various negative outcomes, including depression and relationship difficulties, though the causal direction is often unclear and may be reciprocal. Self-regulation, the ability to control one's thoughts, emotions, and behaviors in pursuit of goals, represents a crucial competence for successful functioning. The famous marshmallow studies by Walter Mischel showed that preschool children's ability to delay gratification, to wait for a larger later reward rather than taking a smaller immediate reward, predicted outcomes decades later, including academic achievement, body mass index, and relationship quality. More recent replications with larger and more diverse samples have qualified these findings, showing that socioeconomic background accounts for much of the predictive power, but the basic importance of self-regulatory capacities is not in question. The mechanisms underlying self-regulation involve both hot emotional systems that generate impulses and cool cognitive systems that can override them, with the balance between systems shifting across development, contexts, and individuals. The ego depletion hypothesis proposed that self-control relies on a limited resource that becomes depleted with use, like a muscle becoming fatigued. Initial studies showed that exerting self-control on one task impaired performance on subsequent self-control tasks, and this pattern was explained by analogy to blood glucose depletion. However, large-scale replication attempts have failed to reliably reproduce the basic ego depletion effect, and meta-analyses suggest that the published literature may be distorted by publication bias and questionable research practices. The current status of ego depletion theory is thus uncertain, with some researchers abandoning the resource metaphor while others propose modifications that might accommodate the mixed evidence. Motivation involves the processes that energize and direct behavior toward goals. Traditional theories distinguish between intrinsic motivation, engaging in an activity for its inherent satisfaction, and extrinsic motivation, engaging for separate outcomes such as rewards or avoidance of punishment. Research has demonstrated conditions under which extrinsic rewards can undermine intrinsic motivation, the overjustification effect, though the boundary conditions and real-world significance of this effect have been debated. Self-determination theory, developed by Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, proposes three basic psychological needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness, whose satisfaction predicts intrinsic motivation, well-being, and performance across diverse cultures and contexts. Goal-setting research has identified features of goals that predict their motivational effectiveness. Specific, challenging goals produce better performance than vague goals or no goals, and commitment to goals is enhanced by participation in goal-setting, public commitment, and feedback on progress. Implementation intentions, specific plans about when, where, and how goal-directed actions will be performed, substantially increase the probability of goal achievement, apparently by automating the initiation of action when planned conditions are encountered. Mindset research by Carol Dweck has shown that beliefs about whether abilities are fixed or malleable influence responses to challenge and failure, with growth mindsets promoting persistence and resilience, while fixed mindsets lead to avoidance of challenge and vulnerability to setback. The psychology of well-being has moved beyond the study of mental illness to examine the positive end of the mental health continuum. Subjective well-being includes cognitive evaluations of life satisfaction, along with the balance of positive and negative emotional experiences. Research has identified factors that predict well-being, including close relationships, meaningful work, adequate income up to a threshold, physical health, and religious or spiritual engagement. The hedonic treadmill or adaptation refers to the tendency for subjective well-being to return toward a baseline after both positive and negative life events, though recent research suggests that adaptation is incomplete and varies across different types of events. Some circumstances, such as unemployment or widowhood, produce lasting decrements in well-being that do not fully resolve with time. Positive psychology as an explicit movement emerged around 2000, associated particularly with Martin Seligman, though it built on earlier humanistic and existential traditions. The field has studied topics including happiness, gratitude, optimism, resilience, meaning, flow, and character strengths. Interventions derived from positive psychology research, such as gratitude journals, savoring exercises, and use of signature strengths, have shown effects on well-being in randomized trials, though effect sizes are often modest and questions remain about long-term benefits and optimal dosing. Critics have raised concerns about the individualism of the positive psychology approach, its potential to blame victims for failing to be happy enough, and the commercialization of well-being through a growing self-help industry. The study of aging and the mind has revealed both decline and preservation across the adult lifespan. Processing speed, working memory, and the ability to inhibit irrelevant information decline with age, beginning in early adulthood and continuing through old age. These declines have downstream effects on more complex cognitive functions, including reasoning, problem-solving, and new learning. However, crystallized abilities, those that reflect accumulated knowledge such as vocabulary and factual information, remain stable or even continue to increase into late life. Expertise in specific domains may provide partial protection against age-related decline within those domains, though it does not prevent decline in underlying cognitive mechanics. The distinction between normal cognitive aging and pathological conditions such as dementia has become increasingly important as populations age. Mild cognitive impairment describes a condition intermediate between normal aging and dementia, involving noticeable cognitive decline beyond typical aging, but without severe impairment in daily functioning. A substantial proportion of individuals with mild cognitive impairment progress to dementia, particularly Alzheimer's disease, but others remain stable or even revert to normal cognition. Research has identified genetic risk factors, biomarkers, and lifestyle factors that predict progression, though accurate individual prediction remains difficult. The search for disease-modifying treatments for Alzheimer's disease has been largely unsuccessful despite enormous investment, with numerous drugs that showed promise in earlier stages failing in definitive clinical trials. Neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to reorganize itself through experience, remains substantial throughout life, though it diminishes with age. Following stroke or injury, the brain can sometimes reorganize to recover lost functions, though recovery is often incomplete. Rehabilitation approaches that exploit neuroplasticity by providing intensive practice of affected functions have shown benefits across various conditions. Cognitive training in healthy older adults has produced some evidence of benefit on trained tasks, but limited evidence of transfer to untrained tasks or everyday functioning. The hope that crossword puzzles, video games, or brain training apps can prevent cognitive decline has not been strongly supported by evidence, though physical exercise, social engagement, and cognitive stimulation may contribute to cognitive reserve that provides some protection. Sleep and the mind are intimately connected, with sleep playing crucial roles in learning, memory consolidation, and cognitive function more broadly. Sleep deprivation impairs attention, working memory, decision-making, and emotional regulation, with effects that accumulate over time. Chronic sleep restriction, common in contemporary societies, produces cognitive deficits that people may not recognize in themselves, as subjective adaptation occurs faster than objective recovery. The stages of sleep, including slow-wave sleep and rapid eye movement sleep, appear to serve different functions in memory consolidation, with different types of learning benefiting from different sleep stages. Dreams, which occur primarily during REM sleep but can occur in other stages, remain poorly understood despite a century of research. Theories of dream function range from the psychoanalytic, treating dreams as wish fulfillments or expressions of unconscious conflict, to the activation synthesis model, which views dreams as the brain's attempt to make sense of random neural activity, to adaptive hypotheses that propose various functions for dreaming in simulation, memory processing, or emotional regulation. The placebo effect demonstrates the power of expectations to produce genuine physiological and psychological changes. When people believe they are receiving an effective treatment, they often improve even when the treatment is inert, and this improvement involves actual changes in brain activity, neurotransmitter release, and physiological function. Placebo effects have been documented across conditions including pain, depression, Parkinson's disease, and anxiety, though their magnitude varies across conditions and individuals. Understanding placebo mechanisms has practical importance for clinical trials, which must distinguish drug effects from placebo effects, and for clinical practice, where harnessing placebo effects ethically could enhance treatment outcomes. The nocebo effect represents the flip side of placebo, where negative expectations produce negative outcomes. Patients told about possible side effects experience those side effects more often than patients not so informed, even when receiving placebo. This creates an ethical dilemma for informed consent, as providing complete information about possible adverse effects may itself cause those effects. Public health communications must navigate the challenge of warning about risks without creating nocebo effects that cause harm. The COVID-19 pandemic provided examples of nocebo effects contributing to vaccine side effects, as awareness of possible side effects increased their reported frequency independent of pharmacological action. The mind-body connection extends beyond placebo and nocebo to encompass psychosomatic medicine more broadly. Psychological stress produces physiological effects through multiple pathways, including the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and the autonomic nervous system. Chronic stress is associated with immune suppression, cardiovascular disease, and accelerated cellular aging as measured by telomere length. Interventions that reduce psychological stress, including relaxation training, meditation, and psychotherapy, can produce improvements in physical health outcomes, though the magnitude of these effects and the mechanisms through which they operate continue to be investigated. Meditation and mindfulness practices have received increasing research attention as potential interventions for both psychological and physical health. Mindfulness involves paying attention to present moment experience with an attitude of acceptance and non-judgment. Mindfulness-based interventions have shown benefits for depression, relapse prevention, anxiety, chronic pain, and other conditions, with effect sizes comparable to established treatments. Neuroimaging studies have documented changes in brain structure and function associated with meditation practice, including alterations in regions involved in attention, emotion regulation, and self-referential processing. However, the field has been criticized for methodological weaknesses, including lack of active control conditions, expectancy effects and publication bias, and some meta-analyses suggest that effect sizes may be smaller than earlier reviews indicated. Consciousness itself remains one of the deepest puzzles about the mind. The fact that there is something it is like to have subjective experience, that physical processes in the brain are accompanied by qualitative feels, has resisted satisfying explanation. Neuroscience can identify neural correlates of conscious experience, the brain states that accompany particular conscious states, but correlates do not explain why those particular physical states should be accompanied by experience at all, or by those particular experiences. Various theories propose different approaches to this hard problem. Some deny that it is really a problem, suggesting that consciousness just is certain kinds of information processing without requiring further explanation. Others propose that consciousness is somehow fundamental to reality, rather than emergent from non-conscious physical processes. Still others argue that the problem reflects limitations in human conceptual frameworks that future progress might transcend. The study of altered states of consciousness, including those produced by drugs, meditation, sleep deprivation, and sensory deprivation, provides windows into the structure of normal consciousness by revealing what can vary. Psychedelic drugs such as psilocybin and LSD produce profound alterations in perception, cognition, and sense of self that participants often describe as among the most meaningful experiences of their lives. Recent clinical trials have shown promise for psychedelic-assisted therapy in treating depression, addiction, and anxiety in terminal illness, though the mechanisms of therapeutic action remain unclear. Some researchers propose that the therapeutic effects result from enhanced neuroplasticity, while others emphasize the profound subjective experiences themselves, and still others point to the altered default mode network activity that characterizes the psychedelic state. Disorders of consciousness following brain injury present both clinical challenges and theoretical opportunities. Patients in vegetative state show cycles of sleep and wakefulness, but no evidence of awareness, while those in minimally conscious state show inconsistent but reproducible signs of awareness. Distinguishing these conditions from locked-in syndrome, in which consciousness is preserved, but motor output is almost entirely absent, requires careful assessment. Neuroimaging studies have revealed that some patients diagnosed as vegetative show brain responses to commands that suggest covert awareness, raising profound questions about diagnosis, prognosis, and end-of-life decision-making. These cases also challenge assumptions about the relationship between consciousness and behavioral responsiveness. The unity of consciousness, the fact that our various experiences occur within a single integrated field of awareness, has been investigated through studies of split brain patients and through philosophical analysis. When the corpus callosum is severed, the two hemispheres can be shown to operate somewhat independently, with the right hemisphere responding to information it receives even when the left hemisphere, which controls speech, cannot report that information. Whether this means that split brain patients have two separate streams of consciousness or a single compromised consciousness remains debated. More broadly, the binding problem asks how the brain integrates information processed in different areas into the unified experience we enjoy, and no fully satisfactory answer has been achieved. The predictive processing framework has emerged as an influential approach to understanding perception, cognition, and action. On this view, the brain constantly generates predictions about incoming sensory signals based on internal models of the world, and perception involves updating these predictions in light of prediction errors, the discrepancies between predicted and actual input. This framework offers an account of how top-down expectations interact with bottom-up signals in perception, how learning involves updating internal models, and how action serves to fulfill predictions about sensory consequences. Some researchers have extended the framework to consciousness itself, proposing that conscious experience arises when predictive models are applied to the processing that generates those models, creating a form of recursive self-modeling. Extended mind theories challenge the assumption that cognition occurs entirely inside the head, proposing instead that cognitive processes can extend into the environment through interaction with external resources. When we use a notebook to remember, a calculator to compute, or a smartphone to navigate, are these external devices part of our cognitive systems in the same way that internal memory or computation is? The thesis has sparked debate about the criteria for genuine cognitive extension versus mere causal interaction, about whether the claim is trivially true or substantively interesting, and about implications for understanding mental disorder, moral responsibility, and personal identity. The social constitution of mind goes beyond extended mind to propose that mental capacities develop through and remain dependent on social interaction. The developing mind is shaped by caregivers who interpret and respond to infant behavior, by cultural practices that structure experience and learning, and by language that provides categories for thinking. Even apparently individual cognitive processes may be internalized versions of originally social processes, as Vygotsky proposed when he argued that internal speech develops from external speech through progressive internalization. The apparent privacy and individualism of mind may be, on this view, a secondary achievement built upon a foundation of social embeddedness. Cultural differences in cognition have been documented across numerous domains, challenging assumptions about the universality of psychological processes. Research comparing Western and East Asian populations has found differences in attention, with East Asians showing more attention to context and relationships, while Westerners focus more on focal objects. Differences in attribution patterns, with Westerners more prone to dispositional attribution, while East Asians give more weight to situational factors, parallel these perceptual differences. The interpretation of these findings remains contested, with debates about whether they reflect deep differences in cognitive style or more superficial differences in defaults and emphasis that can be overridden when the situation demands. The weird problem, the recognition that much psychological research has been conducted on Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic populations that may not represent humanity as a whole, has prompted calls for more diverse sampling and greater attention to cultural variation. Some processes that seemed universal, such as certain visual illusions or preferences in economic games, have shown substantial variation across cultures. This does not necessarily mean that there are no psychological universals, but it does mean that universality must be demonstrated rather than assumed. The challenge of distinguishing cultural variation in expression of underlying universals from genuine variation in underlying processes remains methodologically and theoretically difficult. Evolutionary psychology attempts to understand the mind as the product of natural selection acting over millions of years of hominin evolution. On this view, the mind is composed of numerous specialized adaptations, modules, or mechanisms designed by selection to solve recurrent problems faced by ancestral populations. Such problems include finding food, avoiding predators, choosing mates, raising offspring, and navigating social relationships. Evolutionary psychologists have proposed adaptive explanations for phenomena ranging from mating preferences to fear, responses to moral intuitions. Critics have questioned whether the ancestral environments can be reconstructed with sufficient precision to test adaptive hypotheses, whether observed behaviours are adaptations or byproducts, and whether the modular architecture assumed by many evolutionary psychologists is accurate. Gene-environment interactions complicate any simple nature-nurture dichotomy. The same genetic variants can have different effects depending on environmental conditions, and the same environmental factors can have different effects depending on genetic background. The orchid dandelion hypothesis proposes that some children, orchids, are highly sensitive to environmental quality, thriving in supportive environments but suffering in adverse ones, while others, dandelions, are relatively robust to environmental variation. More recently, differential susceptibility models have suggested that the same genetic variants that confer vulnerability to negative environments may also confer enhanced benefit from positive environments, a symmetric pattern of sensitivity rather than simply vulnerability. Epigenetics has revealed mechanisms by which experience can modify gene expression without altering DNA sequence. Environmental exposures, including stress, nutrition, and toxins, can produce epigenetic changes that alter the functioning of genes, sometimes across generations. The discovery that experiences can produce heritable modifications has been interpreted by some as vindicating Lamarckian inheritance, though this interpretation is contested, as the mechanisms differ from the ones Lamarck envisioned, and the scope of transgenerational effects remains uncertain. For the psychology of individual development, epigenetics provides mechanisms by which early experience could produce lasting changes in brain function and behaviour. Developmental origins of adult disease research has shown that conditions during prenatal and early postnatal development can affect health outcomes decades later. Prenatal exposure to famine, maternal stress, or environmental toxins has been linked to increased risk of mental health problems, cardiovascular disease, and metabolic disorders in adult life. The programming hypothesis proposes that the developing organism adapts to its early environment in ways that are calibrated to expected conditions, with mismatch between developmental and adult environments producing vulnerability to disease. This framework suggests that understanding adult mental health may require attention to conditions across the entire lifespan, including the prenatal period. The mind continues to present fundamental puzzles that resist solution despite centuries of investigation and dramatic advances in the tools available for its study. Questions about the nature of consciousness, the extent of free will, the relationship between mind and brain, and the limits of self-knowledge remain open and contested. What seems clear is that the mind is far more complex, more constructed, more influenced by factors outside of awareness, and more embedded in social and cultural context than common sense suggests. The facts about the mind that research has accumulated do not add up to a neat picture, but rather reveal layers of complexity that deepen rather than resolve the mysteries.